Well, good evening and welcome to our Bible study here at Trinity. A warm welcome to those who are joining us online. We hope this blesses you tonight. I know it's been a fortnight since we were last here, but we're still in Matthew's Gospel. We're still in chapter 9, and we will be picking it up at verse 13. And if you remember last week, the last verse we read from verse 12, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And if you remember, I split that up into two parts. And last week, we looked at the first part of it where Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." This evening, I'm going to read just verses 13 and 14 to start off with. "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then John's disciples came and asked him, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not?" Okay. The second part of Jesus' answer to the Pharisees is, "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So Jesus is now speaking to the Pharisees in a way they will understand. Because as teachers of the law, the Pharisees often say to their students, "Go and learn what this particular passage means." So Jesus is now telling them, the teachers of the law, to go and learn more about the very law which they're supposed to be teaching. Now that must have stung a bit to start with. By saying, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," Jesus is quoting from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, where it says, and I quote, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." The word used in this sentence is the original Hebrew word, hesed, I think is how you pronounce it. It's rich in meaning and depth, but it's a term that doesn't have a direct equivalent in English. And so it's challenging to translate precisely. It's impossible to define hesed apart from the fullness of God's character. Hesed's particular brand of love is a supernatural, multifaceted love that can only be realized, practiced, and experienced through God. Broadly, it describes undeserved kindness and generosity. It describes faithful and reliable love. It describes love in action. It describes God's unfailing love in action. So you could read this sentence as, "I desire faithful and reliable love, not sacrifice. I desire kindness and generosity, not sacrifice. I desire love in action, not sacrifice." God doesn't mean his people, by the way, to circumvent sacrificial offerings and to cut them out, but rather he wants more than just ritual obedience. Now, we all know the Pharisees were really, really good at ritual obedience, but they were slow to learn the deeper meaning of things. They failed to grasp that God gives ritual as an avenue to developing a closer relationship with himself. Ritual is not meant to be an end in and of itself. It's not a way to absolve yourself of social responsibility. And I mean, I could quote here, I grew up in the Anglican Church, and they're really, really good at ritual. Really good. And when I was a lay reader before I came here, often I'd stand out the front and look around, and you could tell people are reciting the words, they're thinking about tomorrow's dinner and next year's holiday and whatever, and nothing but what's going into their head is what they're saying is not what they're thinking about. But this ritual is so much in it. If you combine that with a relationship with God, then you've got something really worth having. And that's what this is meant to be saying. We don't do away with the rituals, but just remember that you've got a relationship with God and combine the two of them. Jesus tells the Pharisees that he did not come to call the righteous. He came to call sinners. Now, the Pharisees assumed themselves to be righteous already. They didn't think they needed saving. Jesus came to call those who understood themselves to be sinners and in need of mercy, in need of forgiveness, and in need of a Savior. Because let's be honest, if you're in what I could call the Pharisee group, where you already think you're righteous, you already think you're good enough, then that is a barrier you've built between you and God. And that is, until you break that barrier down, you're wasting your time. Jesus is no good to you. But Jesus has come to call people who know they've got a problem, people who know they need him. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, exactly right. One thing that was true back then, and it's still true today, is that when people are given a glimpse of the loving face of God in Jesus, people flock to him. And they still do today. Once they've seen the loving face of Jesus, and by the way, they see the face of Jesus through us. Once they've seen Jesus, they still flock to him today. Do you know, when you stop and think about it, it's no wonder the Pharisees hated Jesus. Because he was always pulling them up. Absolutely, yeah. But in the right kind of way. Because Jesus is trying to get through to these hard people. We know that God doesn't desire anybody to go to hell. And he was trying to get these people to see the truth. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, the old saying, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, was applicable. So I'm going to have a look now at verses 14 to 17. We'll make that. Yes, Then John's disciples came and asked him, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but you and your disciples do not fast? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do men pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and then both are preserved. Now, the first thing that occurred to me when I read this is, if this feast was all about Matthew and his tax collector friends, and Jesus eating with his disciples, what were John's disciples doing there? John's mission was to prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah, and that mission had mostly been accomplished by now. By the time Jesus launched into his public ministry, John's work was more or less over. It's possible that by this time, John was already in prison. And so some of John's disciples have started to follow Jesus. And that could very well be while they were there. It's also possible that as Jesus' disciple, Andrew, was a former disciple of John the Baptist, that he drew people there as well because he had friends who were still John's followers. So that's likely answered my question, what were John's disciples doing there? But why were they so concerned about Jesus' disciples not fasting? Like I said, it's possible that John was already in prison by now. That would have involved some kind of a grief on account of his disciples. Perhaps that's why they were fasting, in grief because of John's dilemma. Fasting, after all, was the natural expression of sorrow. And perhaps they wondered why Jesus' disciples didn't follow with them in expressing sorrow for John's dilemma. But it's also possible that because the Pharisees and John's disciples fasted twice a week, this mention of fasting here has led scholars to believe that Matthew's feast for Jesus was held on a Monday or a Thursday, which were the traditional fast days for the Pharisees and for John's disciples. So John's disciples, having become aware that Jesus and his disciples are fasting, they want to know why Jesus and his disciples are not fasting like they are. They probably think, well, it's a Tuesday or a Thursday, whichever one it was. It's a fast day. We're fasting. Why aren't you? But whatever the reason for asking this question, one thing you can be sure of, the Pharisees would have seen a golden opportunity to create mischief. Some scholars believe that the Pharisees put John's disciple up to asking this question. Firstly, because they probably didn't have the courage to go and ask Jesus himself. And secondly, in the hope of causing trouble, of causing a rift between Jesus' disciples and John's disciples. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Yes, they were still attached to the law. They hadn't quite cottoned on yet to who Jesus was. Absolutely. Troublemaking. They've probably learned by now that Jesus is trouble and try in any way to get him out they can. Because by now you can bet your life they'd label Jesus a troublemaking rebel. Someone who was teaching his disciples and anyone who would listen to go against the religious and social norms of the day. And Jesus' condemnation of these religious leaders just made them hate them even more. So anything they could do to discredit Jesus and turn people against him in their eyes was a bonus.
John was taken away, and Jesus hadn't been taken away.
Yeah.
And when Jesus will go, then they will fast.
Yeah.
John will have been taken. He's gone into prison.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's putting them under what he said.
Exactly. So once again, the Pharisees have seen a golden opportunity to cause trouble. And they've given John's disciples the bullets to fire. Having asked the question, Jesus' reply to them is, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? And this was, I believe, was an answer designed to convince John's disciples, because John had already identified Jesus as the bridegroom. And so by Jesus saying, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is still with them, that's going to have struck a chord with John's disciples. And if you want to look up a verse for this, look at John 3:29 and 30. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him, and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater, and I must become less. That's the words of John the Baptist. So John's already identified Jesus as the bridegroom, and when Jesus confirms that himself, that would have struck a chord with John's disciples. John Ellicott says this: "The words were full of meaning in themselves, but they only gain their full significance when we connect them with the teaching of the Baptist recorded in John 3:29. He had pointed to Jesus as the bridegroom. He had taught them that the coming of the bridegroom was the fulfillment of his joy." And Kaufman's commentary makes this point. And it might help if you can imagine yourself at this meal at the moment, this feast. And Kaufman said, "There is a heavenly genius in this answer of Christ. The habit of the Pharisees of indulging every appetite to the point of gluttony and drunkenness at a wedding makes this a center shot. Since Christ is the bridegroom, this is a wedding in a spiritual sense. It's likely that this reply was greeted with howls of laughter." So you can imagine what's going on. They're all sat around this table. Jesus makes this comment. The people who've got what Jesus said and understand, I can imagine there being howls of laughter. And Jesus goes on to tell them that there will come a time when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. Kaufman continues with his comment. By continuing on from his comment on howls of laughter, he says, "Yet there is a tragic note here also. The holy bridegroom will be taken away from them, that is, murdered by these same pious hypocrites who were so solicitous about the strict observance of their petty fasts." So in other words, the very people who were pulling Jesus up for not fasting are the ones who are going to be taking the bridegroom away. After this comment about the fasting and the bridegroom, Jesus goes on to make two more illustrations. The first illustration speaks of Jesus being with them, but soon to be taken from them. And these next two illustrations speak about a new way of living that Jesus brings compared to the old way of living. The new cloth represents the new covenant or the teachings of Jesus. It's fresh, undressed, and full of life. The old garment symbolizes the existing religious practices and traditions. These were inadequate and needed transformation. The patch of new cloth refers to attempts to blend the new teachings with the old practices. However, this approach doesn't work because the new and the old are incompatible. And the resulting tear, when the new cloth is sewn onto the old garment, it causes a worse tear. Similarly, trying to mix old and new leads to confusion and harm. Jesus is saying to his hearers that now he has come, they should not expect to continue the old traditions of the Jewish religion. He's not come to repair, to improve, or update Judaism. Judaism was now useless, worn out and finished. Jesus brought something that was entirely new. If you like, Judaism was like a worn-out old coat that couldn't be mended. It was like a brittle old wineskin that could not stand the pressure of the new wine. Again, Kaufman says, the illustration in this place is simply that of trying to patch an old garment with a piece of new. That is unshrunk cloth, which, if attempted, would prove unavailing as soon as the garment was washed. The shrinkage of the new piece would tear itself out and the rent would be made worse. The application is that Jesus did not come to apply Christianity as a new patch upon the old garment of Judaism. Christianity was not designed as an addition to Judaism. It is not as a patch upon an old system, but as an excitingly new and different religion altogether. And Jesus is challenging the Pharisees and the religious leaders who clung to legalism and ritualistic practices. He's encouraging a radical transformation, a new heart, and a fresh way of living. These illustrations go beyond literal cloth. It's about embracing the new life in Christ and letting go of the old way of legalism. The only trouble is, very often human beings, we're not very good at letting go of things. We like our own comfort zones, and we don't like being dragged out of it. And that's still true today. But in a way, if we've got any advantage today compared to the people of Jesus' time, it's got to be the prayer closet. Because that's what keeps us from getting stale in our comfort zone. It's the prayer closet that connects us with God, that keeps it fresh and exciting, and allows Jesus to lead us on out of our comfort zone. And we're safe in the knowledge that he's got us. If he says step out, then it's safe, and we know it's going to be safe. Okay, verses 18 and 19. While he was saying this, a ruler came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Now, the first thing I noticed in the first line of this new paragraph, while he was saying this, those words immediately connect this incident with the ruler's daughter with the meal at Matthew's house. Jesus was still at Matthew's house. He may still have been talking to John's disciples when the ruler came up to him. This man has gone looking for Jesus, which is unusual in itself because he's a ruler. He's supposed to be one of these people who finds Jesus a troublemaker. And yet he's come looking for Jesus. Matthew leaves the ruler unnamed and only tells us that he is a ruler. But Mark tells us his name is Jairus. Now the ruler, as a ruler of the synagogue, he's got authority over the conduct of the public worship in Capernaum's synagogue. Its very administration is under his care. He was responsible for maintaining the building, ensuring it was well organized and ready for worship. He was responsible for selecting individuals to participate in the service, including reading from the Torah and leading prayers. And he managed all the administrative tasks of the building. So he's a man of considerable position in the community. He was known for his deep faith in God. He was regarded as a pious and righteous man. His commitment to his faith and his leadership position highlights his devotion to Jewish customs and beliefs. Come into that? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Jairus was a well-respected leader in his community, and his reputation would no doubt have preceded him. But he comes to Jesus for help. And not only does he come to Jesus for help, but the first thing he does is kneel. And as you know, kneeling is an accepted sign of worship. And so this man who's a leader of the synagogue, a pillar of the Jewish community, standing up for Judaism, if you like, he's come and knelt before Jesus. He risks severe ridicule from his peers, but he risks more than that. A commentator named Fowler says, if he is trusting his cause to a Nazarene rabbi with whose views his unbelieving colleagues violently differed, he has more than personal pride to forfeit. This could have cost him a lot. His position in the synagogue, his position, his social standing, it could have cost him everything. And having found Jesus and come to him, he tells Jesus, in effect, that his daughter is in need of Jesus' healing touch. Now, there's a difference in what he says, depending on which gospel you read. Matthew records him as saying she's dead, while Mark and Luke record him as saying she is sick. A commentary called Contending for the Faith says this: the Greek word rendered is even now dead, does not necessarily mean, as our translation would express, that she had actually expired, but only that she was dying or about to die. It's likely that a father in these circumstances would use a word as nearly expressing actual death as would be consistent with the fact that she was still alive. The passage may be expressed thus: my daughter was so sick that she must by this time be dead, or she was on death's bed. Richard Trench, who was a 19th century Dean of Westminster Abbey, said this: when the father left his child, she was at the last gasp. He knew not whether to regard her now as alive or dead. He only knew that life was ebbing so fast when he quitted her side that she could scarcely be living still. And yet, having no certain notices of her death, he was perplexed whether to speak of her as departed or not, and thus at one moment would express himself in one language and in the next another. But you know, in a way, whether she was alive or dead at that moment is academic. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is about this incident that a synagogue ruler, Jairus, has showed an extraordinary level of faith in Jesus. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. 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 It, absolutely. It shows an extraordinary level of faith in Jesus. Absolutely. Yeah. It does. Yes. We have to get to the bottom before we start to climb up. Yep. He certainly did. Yeah. So if we look at that commentary, Contending for the Faith again, it says the ruler might have seen other cases where Jesus performs miracles with a simple touch. He might assume, therefore, that if the master comes, he will follow the same procedure. This man's faith is impressive. There seems to be no hesitancy in his words, she shall live.
How do we know who the ruler is?
Well, we have to go by Mark's word, because Mark tells us in his gospel he names the ruler. So it's very likely that the disciples of Jesus would have known who he was, because he was a well-known figure. So I'll touch on this a bit later on, but you've got to remember that Matthew is not terribly concerned with details. He's just concerned with the fact that the miracles have taken place. So that's why he omits a lot of what other gospels put in.
I was wondering what you said.
Yeah.
I was wondering where it says who he was.
Yeah, no, you read Mark's gospel, it tells you who he is in Mark's gospel, the same incident that Mark records it. So Jesus' response seems to be immediate. He gets up from reclining at the table, and with his disciples, he follows Jairus to his house. Now, it's worth noting here as well that Jesus could have healed at a distance. He said to the centurion, "It will be as you have believed. Go." But he didn't. He responded to the man's request to go and lay hands on her, perhaps because that was the level of the man's faith. And Jesus always meets us where we are, not where we should be. This man believed that if Jesus came and touched his daughter, she'd be healed. And that's what Jesus was going to do, go and touch his daughter, because that was the level of the man's faith. Yep. Yep. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Yes. Yes. Jesus always meets us where our level of faith is. And also, don't forget, it was customary for the Jewish prophets in conferring favors to lay their hands on the person benefited. Jesus had probably done this loads of times, and this synagogue ruler would probably have witnessed Jesus doing it thousands of times. So that's why he knew that if you come and touch my daughter, she's going to be healed. And then, of course, we have to consider the fact that Jesus would likely have known how this was going to end. That far more people would have benefited from seeing the power of God by him going to the ruler's house than would have by him healing remotely as he did for the centurion. In other words, if he said to this man, "Go, she's healed," it's probably only the man himself, the ruler, and the disciples would ever have got to know about this. But by going and responding to this man's request and laying hands on the daughter, everybody who's around her is going to see what's going on, and they will all be benefited by it. And of course, it's always possible as well, going on to the next story, that Jesus knew someone was going to need his help, someone who was unable to come to him openly. I'm going to push on a bit later, if you don't mind. We'll read verses 20 to 22. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I can only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed from that moment. The only thing we're told about this woman's condition is she's got an issue of blood. Now, medical science today has identified several possible conditions that can cause long-term bleeding in women. And I'm not going to go into them now. If you're interested, look it up on Google. There's tons of information on it. But first of all, let's look at this woman's issue of bleeding and why it was such a big deal. First of all, the woman was considered to be unclean. Leviticus 15, 19 to 23. When a woman has a regular flow of blood, the impurity of a monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anyone who sits on anything she touches will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Anyone who touches anything she sits on will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, when anyone touches it, they will be unclean till evening. Now that, for a start, means isolation, even in her own home. She would probably have been in constant pain. She's been banned from the temple and from social gatherings. And just imagine today being banned from church or from somebody's party because you're bleeding. Anything she touched would be deemed unclean. This is going to have an impact on cooking and cleaning. If she's cooking and you touch it, you're unclean. Exactly, yep. The Bible doesn't tell us if she had a husband, but if she did, her husband would have to sleep in a separate bed. She may not even have had a husband because this problem of hers could have been considered grounds for divorce. So if she was married, it's very likely that her husband has gone off into the sunset. She spent a lot of money, all her savings, on medical treatment for a condition that medicine at the time was probably unable to cure. And because of this, she's likely to be at the end of her tether. She's been suffering this for 12 years. 12 years of pain, 12 years of isolation, 12 years of being treated like a leper, 12 years of spending all her money and seeing no result. So in a desperation, she reaches out to Jesus. She's obviously heard he's around, and she's gone quietly looking for him. It's not really clear whether she knew Jesus was there and made a deliberate decision to go and see him, or whether she just happened to see Jesus passing and grabbed the chance on impulse. But whichever one it was, she approaches Jesus and touches his cloak. Now, she does this as stealthily as possible because she doesn't want to be seen. Don't forget, she's in a small town. Everybody will know who she is. So she tries to sneak up on Jesus to just even touch the hem of his cloak. And I imagine personally that she got as far as touching the hem of his cloak out of respect for Jesus to try and avoid touching him directly. It was no doubt her intention to touch his cloak, get healed, and then sneak away without being seen. That was what was ideal in her mind. And once again, the main point of this story is faith. This woman had the faith to believe, if I can only touch his garment, I will be healed. It's likely that she'd been very much aware that other people had been healed by Jesus. It was no secret. Rumor control was wild out there. Everybody would have known what Jesus had been doing. And so she believed with her heart that if she could just get to Jesus and even touch his cloak, I will be healed. You know, at that moment, she chose to focus on Jesus, not focus on her illness. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Tremendous amount of faith, determination, and courage. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. 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 So she's planning to sneak in, touch his cloak, and slip quietly away. And she's even prepared to defy all the laws and social norms of the day to achieve this. It was a risky maneuver. Imagine the consequences if she hadn't been healed. She'd have been stoned for a start. Yeah. Once they realized she was there, they would probably have created a path for her. Back to the way, I'm not touching you. Out of my way, I don't want to be unclean. Yeah. As usual, Matthew gives us little detail about the incident, intent only in recording the fact that this miracle has happened. If we want to know a bit more, we've got to look at Mark and Luke. And just have a look at Mark chapter 5, 27 to 30. And it reads this: immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And Luke chapter 8, 43 to 48 says, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus said. So this woman's faith is rewarded. She was absolutely right in her assertion that all she had to do was touch his cloak and she'd be healed. And it all went well, as far as she was concerned, right up until the point where Jesus notices something's happened. In other words, she got busted. Sensitive, yes. But imagine, put yourself in this woman's position now for a minute. Imagine you've just touched the hem of his garment. You felt this healing power. And then all of a sudden he turns around and said, "Who touched me?" and looks at you. Imagine her feelings of horror when she realized she's been busted and challenged. She's a woman who's been made something of an outcast for 12 years, destined never to have physical contact with anybody again as long as her condition troubled her. And now she's been busted by Jesus trying to get this healing. In the middle of a crowd of people who knew that she shouldn't have been there and knew that she shouldn't have been doing what she had been doing. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So when she touched the edge of his cloak, there was a flow of power. She felt it, and Jesus felt it too. We know that she felt it because we are told that she knew she'd been healed. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Absolutely, you're quite right. But listen to Jesus' response to the woman's actions. He tells her to take heart because her faith has healed her. He confirmed what she already knew in her heart. She knew, "I've been healed." Jesus confirmed it. Take heart, your faith has healed you. Matthew Poole sums it up like this, and it's quite a long reading, but bear with me. Matthew relates this story shortly, as he doth many others, being only intent upon recording the miracle. We must here supply something out of Mark and Luke. Mark saith, "And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' And his disciples said to him, 'Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and thou sayest, Who touched me?' And he looked about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing that what was done in her, came and fell down before him, and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, Daughter, thy faith has made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague." And Luke reports the same circumstances with little variation. Christ was not ignorant of this woman's coming and touching his garment. He doubtlessly influenced her to the motion. His inquiry was therefore only that the miracle might be taken notice of. He knew that virtue was gone out of him and had healed the woman, for he had commanded it so to go out, or she had not been healed. But he desired that the people might take notice that she was healed by his grace, not by any magical virtue of his clothes. The woman is brought openly to come and confess it, that she had touched his clothes and that she was healed. She feared and trembled lest she should have offended. Christ comforts her by assuring her of the cure and telling her that her faith in him as an instrumental cause had effected it. And so, in other words, he's not done anything to try and embarrass this lady. His intention is to reassure her firstly, but to let everybody around know that she's healed. Because if she had sneaked in, been healed, and sneaked away again, they would only have had her word for the fact that she'd been healed. Exactly. But now she's been busted by Jesus. Everybody knows what's happened. Everybody knows that she's been healed because Jesus has said it. Your faith has made you well. And so that is a benefit for her, not only because he reassures her that she's done the right thing by sneaking up, but now everybody around knows that she's been healed, and they can start to treat her like a human being again. And I'm going to leave it there. Not his clothes that's done it, but him. Exactly. And I'm going to leave it there for tonight.